Welcome to the next installment of the Michael Brooks Tribute Series. My name is Ben Basche. I'm here with Jeremy Johnson and Brent Cooper. And you've heard a lot from the TMBS community, from the extended TMBS family, in a lot of these incredible panels, in-depth panels digging into the future of the left, carrying Michael's project forward. And I think if you had watched Michael's last stream, called the Integral Theory stream, he was fleshing out something in the last, let's say, year, 6 months of his life, which tied together kind of all the threads that he was pulling together, from his internationalism to spirituality, to his ability to also speak about human distinction, about the self, about our work as individuals, without making excuses for society, making excuses for political economy. And this integral theory and a similar theory also that we can get into today, Metamodernism, I think was where he was trying to break new ground. And when we tragically lost him, I think this last thread was one of the things that we are going to need to work the most to think through, I think, to ground our analysis in the material as he would have wanted us to. And it was, I think, an open space, a feeling of a new way to make sense of the world that he felt in the wake of the Bernie loss. I remember a hope from him, like a determination, a sort of openness and a feeling of needing to tie together the loose ends, to bring it all together, to kind of get the toxicities of the left, to figure out how to square those circles, to stop being our own worst enemy, to focus on power. And I think in his study and background in the works of guys like Ken Wilber and Sri Aurobindo, I think he really built his worldview. And I think it's up to us to look at reconstructing, taking forward, and learning from what he was learning from. And I think he was our teacher, and he was also the eternal student. And this is one of the things he studied a lot there towards the end. So I'll let Brent and then Jeremy introduce themselves, and then we'll get into a discussion on these topics and kind of where Michael left us to follow his footsteps.
Thanks, Ben. I'm a very online leftist, a sociologist by training, activist insofar as I can sort of support people like Michael and make my work dovetail with theirs. And I wanted to actually quickly tell a kind of anecdote of how we first connected. We were following each other for about a year before Michael messaged me, and he made the first move, which was kind of very flattering to me, because I was just trying to support his project as much as I could. But I was watching the comedy panel, and the guys were joking about how Michael would be on Twitter while he's on Majority Report, right? And that relates to my anecdote, because the first time Michael DM'd me on Twitter, it was in the morning, and I answered a couple hours later. And by the time I answered, Majority Report was live, and I didn't know this. And I replied to him, and we struck up a conversation, and then I tuned into Majority Report, and it's live, and he's there texting with me. And I'm like, what are you doing, you machine? You stop multitasking. Like, I'm distracting you from the show. And he's asking me questions like what's your main gig? What do you how you doing? While he's in the middle of the show. So that just speaks to, what a multitasker he was, what a workhorse he was, and how compassionate he was about his colleagues and his patrons and his partners. And I think, it speaks to his radicalism and his sense of humor too. All those things dovetail. And so maybe I'll quickly dive into metamodernism before going to Jeremy. And we're not going to have enough time to unpack it fully, but I think that's a good point of departure, because in another panel, Wozny Lambre was saying, these big words like misogynoir, like ordinary people don't talk like that. They don't know what that means. They don't care. And it gets in the way of of discourse sometimes, and it's similar with metamodernism. You know, this is a 25-cent word, and it's part of a cluster of a bunch of other terminology that puts people off and confuses people and gets appropriated in different directions. So the way into it for leftists is to recognize that what the left coalition under Bernie Sanders and Michael Brooks were already doing was very much normatively what I call metamodern. It was synthetic. It was very functional, even though we lost, you know, it was very honest. And having that kind of reflexivity and ability to lose and recognize what's happening in the world is I think, part of that metamodern ethos. Now, the term has a complicated history, right? Like, some scholars refer to it to point to historiographical and artistic and cultural trends. And I think that research is very important, and it's a conversation almost nobody has been having as part of the public discourse, and on the left especially. I think there's a ton of opportunity there. One of the unique contributions I make, because this discourse emerges as kind of a transpartisan thing that apparently explains everything, I problematize it and say, actually, hypermodernism expresses most of the negative trends we see in the world around technology, excess consumerism, exploitation, etc. And there's a very comprehensive discourse around that. And there's also a kind of comprehensive discourse around metamodernism, but they're actually more coherent if you juxtapose them. And so the way this relates to the culture war and to most people's literacy is what happened to postmodernism. Right? In the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, we started to see postmodernism as a kind of discourse and movement start to wane, start to fragment further. And we're in this in-between space in the 90s between the Cold War and the War on Terror, right? And you have these performative media spectacles like the Gulf War, and it's just a part of advancing late capitalism's hypermodern militarist agenda, right? And so I think, you know, I spent a lot of time in this high theory to get a different perspective. And Michael synthesized a lot of very avant-garde social theory, like Amartya Sen, you know, Cornel West. And what I was trying to do was to bridge with Michael, and he was trying to do the same. You know, we really connected and bonded over things like the critique of the IDW, because it was just so like fish in a barrel almost, you know. But what we really wanted was engagement and to debunk them and to succeed, right? And that's what continuing Michael Brooks's legacy is about for me, is winning, not just the synthesis, but that is the starting point that he was trying to deploy. And it's unfortunate because you know, Michael Brooks tried to promote these ideas, but because they're so dense and elusive, you know, they still don't have a lot of traction. And you know, despite his endorsement, the needle hasn't moved much on where these public discourses are. So I hope to crack open that with other leftists, as Jeremy and I have been doing for over a year, quite fruitfully, I think. So and it's great to talk to Ben again and to develop these things further.
Jeremy, what do you think, just to follow up off of what Brent said, what do you think it is that Michael identified in the IDW that they got right? What was the opening? Because it does sit adjacent in some ways in the milieu with metamodern, you know, or integral spaces. And I think the integral or metamodern left is still a minority of, you know, those folks in those consciousness or intellectual communities. So it does kind of relate in that emergent sense of this search for meaning, this search for kind of a grounding in some kind of theory of things. So what did Michael and identify, and what is it that they took advantage of to you know, especially when they were at their peak?
Yeah, no, good question. First of all, thanks Ben for facilitating this panel, and it's good to be here with you and Brent. Um, this is sort of a good dovetail for how Michael and I also started to really engage and have conversations with each other. He reached out to me as well. I think through Facebook, if I'm remembering correctly. I got a DM on Facebook, and I didn't even know Michael was on there or that we had friended each other. But apparently we we were, and he was sort of part of the extended sort of integral theory community, and he had been for many years. And so I was always sort of on the periphery, and so was he. I knew he was interested in that, and then he was doing some kind of political show, and he saw me posting, of course, about whatever I was doing in terms of the theory work and etc. But some of our first conversations was in the context of the IDW and Jordan Peterson, particularly our mutual admiration and appreciation of the depth psychologist James Hillman, who Michael brought up many times, talking about a particular interview book where Hillman is talking about, it's been 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's still getting worse. And Michael, I think, was positioning Hillman as a sort of antidote to Peterson, because Hillman was talking about some of the same psycho-spiritual, meaning crisis-oriented questions that were going on in the modern world, but not contextualizing them in sort of a neoliberal, atomized ideology, and going, your particular health and your particular mental wellness is intimately related to the health of the society, socioeconomically, et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't want to disconnect those. So I think Michael was really positioning Hillman as sort of this counter to Peterson. And so that's how our conversations really took off a few years ago, I think maybe 2017 or so. But I think in this context, Peterson and the IDW and what they're talking about, I think they call it the meaning crisis, right? I mean, we're living in postmodern capitalist realist conditions where we're alienated from meaningful engagement with life, the fullness of a kind of, having a meaningful, rich experience, meaningful work, community. So I think, generally speaking, the problem of alienation is something that the IDW is, or was, I don't know if we want to say it's over or not at the moment, but I think these communities aggregated around Peterson because he was talking about, not just cleaning your room, but some kind of, commentary on meaning and the hero's journey and archetypes, etc. Now, of course, Peterson, and the critique I think Michael had, of course, was that Peterson's ideology was deeply neoliberal. It was clean your own room, right? Find your own kind of personalized meaning, and not relate back to a kind of communal sense of, well, society needs to change, actually. I am sick as a result, or in part because of the conditions of the culture that we live in. And that requires a kind of understanding of material conditions. So I think this is where Michael is really interested in sort of addressing the concerns and the kind of crisis, the cultural crisis that the IDW was speaking to, but doing it in a way that was much more integrated and integral oriented, rather than, cleaving the individual as a sort of atomized force where we only really need to take care of ourselves. He was very critical of that. So, and just part of like the background too, I mean, I think Michael, Lisha and I talked about Michael, being interested in Ken Wilber back in his high school years. I think Wilber was sort of a formative thinker for him. And I would actually attribute Michael's integral thinking as something that was innate to him. I think he was just naturally an integrative thinker. He was deeply pragmatic. He was intellectually curious. And so I think he resonated with what Wilber was doing, which was saying, yeah, let's look at sociological conditions and economic conditions, but let's not forget, let's say, individual meaning or spirituality, right? So he was a kind of Wilber is kind of like a both end style thinker, and I think Michael very much was as well. So the affinity there was very natural. So we spent a lot of time talking about and joking about Ken Wilber, because I think Wilber also has sort of leaned in recent years towards the third way kind of neoliberal, and then also he's been very sympathetic with the IDW, so particularly Jordan Peterson. So we had critiques of Wilber for that, but that also, I think, the framework that Wilber offers that Michael saw as a potential tool for the left is integrative thinking, promoting complex thinking, and kind of giving you a training wheel format to begin to kind of fold in different dimensions in your thinking as a kind of practice, right? This is something that we were talking about maybe doing in terms of like getting folks to read. I mean, he recommended reading A Theory of Everything and reading Marx alongside that. So he really wanted to instill a more holistic approach and more complex oriented approach to our thinking, whilst being deeply grounded in the material conditions and what's going on with labor and what's going on with the left, and being literate with all of that as well. So I'll pause here.
Do you think that, and I'll kind of leave it to either one of you, do you think that, what is it about the sort of both and that is a sort of core strain of, or mode of thinking that I think both metamodernism and integral, the integral theory, the integral movement espouse? And I think they also kind of remind me of Michael's mastery over the dialectic and over kind of holding contradictions in his head and kind of finding the real synthesis, and almost like in a way like the actual third way, as opposed to kind of where Ken Wilber himself ended up. What is it about the way that I think Michael may have been able to do? How was he able to do that sort of integral work without ending up in a sort of third position? What was his way of synthesizing, and how does that kind of find its roots in some of those theories that he was studying?
Ben, Brent, do you want to tackle that first, and then I'll have some thoughts?
Yeah. Sure. This might be just a ramble, but I mean, it's a methodological question, which is tricky because there's so many methods, and part of what I was saying is like Michael's work, it dovetailed with my own, but from some different sources and some similar sources. And part of what I've realized through researching complexity and researching discourse is that, and again, it goes back to the waning of postmodernism in the 90s. Like none of this is new, right? There's so much overlapping and redundant discourse. So I think as it pertains to Michael's method, it, like my own, it's about really shrewdly seeking anchoring points and leveraging points in the discourse, like who is the best theorist on XYZ issue, and then how can we aggregate those into a level up, right? And how can we synthesize those? And so just recognizing that that's the project, which speaking for myself happened like over 10 years ago as sort of an awakening, right? That we had to go beyond new atheism and things like this. Like it's very important to be self-critical in that regard, right? So if the IDW had a modicum of self-criticism, we could have avoided a lot of this culture war stuff and actually had a sincere, open dialogue. And so it was clear to me that that's kind of what Michael's method was, right? Very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, very complexity focused, and also trying to bridge the gap between like elitism and common language, right? And between classes. And, a quote from his last live stream was like, we need to be able to think like outside of singular frames, right? It's a kind of multi-perspectival thing. And so like he said, local, national, international, simultaneously, right? North, south, east, west, long-term thinking, empathy. And so integral theory is an inroad to these types of things for sure. And actually, what I call Nordic metamodernism is sort of a bridge between contemporary integral theory going way beyond Wilber and being genuinely advocating for a paradigm shift, whereas clearly, as Jeremy said and Michael has said, like Wilber got stuck in his own whatever color scheme or first tier kind of pontificating about who's who in the IEW. And maybe I'll just add a point about what they did right. Like I don't want to give them too much credit. I have in my writing, but I'll say what they did right functionally was they were louder and got more traction than the left did, right? It's not a good thing. It's not what they did kind of ethically right, but it's what they did functionally right. And so we need to intervene in that. We need to be a part of that. And the constant, kind of bouncing off each other of like Eric Weinstein and Sam Seder speaks to that tragedy that Michael Brooks couldn't be heard by people like Eric Weinstein, right? They just think criticism of what they're doing is trivial, when it's not. It's really, we're coming from a way more advanced place about globalization and human well-being. So I'll hand it back to Jeremy there.
Yeah, I think, part of what you're saying is like, Brent, is to kind of step into the public discussion, right? As a public intellectual, and that's what Michael is good at as a pundit, as a journalist, as somebody who is active, at least through his streaming and through the show, through the Majority Report and through TMBS, is, stay engaged in these sort of conversations, offer critiques, and then offer an alternative. And I think this is like, and I can share this as we go along, but, one of the last conversations I had with Michael, I had gotten accustomed to pulling out a notepad, because we would start, he would always ask how I'm doing, but he would launch into very interesting discussion, and immediately I would be taking notes. So I just got into the habit of having a pen and paper ready to kind of get down what he was discussing. So I have a short transcription of that last conversation, and I'd be happy to share bits and pieces of it with this panel. But part of what he was talking about is the left needs exit strategies, right? Like, the left needs to be able to offer some kind of alternative to merely critique, or a kind of, I don't want to exactly call it reductive, but to only focus on the socioeconomic, is to ignore the fullness, the full dimensionality of the human being. And I think he writes about this very clearly and very succinctly in his book Against the Left, when he writes, what we need is a cosmopolitan socialism premised on real material needs that expresses itself in criticism, art, movement building, and anything else that drives politics. And he says we need an integral approach that fuses universal desires, aspirations, and material concerns. With the recognition that we do live in in fact, live in a globalized, interconnected, and neoliberal world, right? So he was really looking at the whole human being, our aspirational needs, our spiritual needs, our meaning-making needs. Those are integral to an analysis of our material conditions. So the both end aspect is really just like written into the core of what he articulated as cosmopolitan socialism. So I think, for part of the kind of the setup we were talking about for the fall, and for TMBS going forward, and really just for the left as a movement going forward, is to really give the left these tools to think with complexity, to be more holistic in that integral approach that he's referencing Gramsci with, in terms of talking and speaking to our aspirational needs, our meaning-making needs, right? So that means talking about spirituality. That means talking about the meaning crisis. That means looking at the other dimensions of being human, while also being really well-trained as complex thinkers, right? And so, again, I think Michael is really pragmatic with that. It's like, if it's an integral theory, fantastic. Let's read integral theory. Let's sort of fold that into the discourse and the literature reading and the recommendations, etc. If it's in, let's say, peer-to-peer and common studies, which he was beginning to look at as well. If it's in metamodernism, let's take it from these disciplines and these schools of thinking and see how they synthesize. And so I think that's really kind of at the core. I don't know if that directly answers your question, Ben, but the both end is really, really like foundational there, I think, with what Michael is wanting to do.
Yeah, I mean, and the meta point is that integral in the way that Michael interpreted it, both in terms of, I think, his understanding of the theory, but also just, as you said, kind of his innate integral way of thinking. It means that you can take the expertise or take nuggets from certain traditions, theories, people, and leave, something that's not necessary. So even with Ken Wilber himself, you know, he is the kind of the example, the meta example. And I think that was one of Michael's gifts. He was always on the lookout. He was an innovator. He was sort of rummaging through different theories, different angles, different ways of looking at the problem, because we sort of do find ourselves as the left at like a cold start after Bernie, after Corbyn, after Syriza, after all the failures of, you know, our kind of next wave of electoral, you know, left politics. And so he was on the lookout for how to construct a left, what would aid in class formation, what would help shift the balance of forces, what would help with this sort of neoliberal versus neo-reaction, what would break that. And I think that's what he was looking at Integral to help do. It was kind of like one of his tools to sort of dig for, okay, what else can we use? But, you know, let's not get carried away with the baggage that some of these tools have.
Yeah, exactly. You know, one of the words that I think was floating around in his discussions in late 2020 was, or mid 2020, was regenerative. And I think for him, he saw a lot of these sort of versions of synthesis, whether it's like peer-to-peer, metamodernism, integral theory, et cetera, as giving an edge to what we were doing. And also, I think there's a practical reason why he was very interested in both metamodernism and integral theory, in that these helped us avoid the tendency in a neoliberal culture of atomization, right? Not to get myopic with a particular discipline or too single-minded about a particular field or way of thinking, to always be kind of balancing ourselves. And I don't just mean this intellectually as well. I mean, he talked about this in terms of his now well popularized phrase, you know, be ruthless to institutions, be kind to people, just taking the macro and the micro, the individual and the kind of the sociological, and holding them together, really holding them together. And I know there's going to be a spirituality panel as well, but part of the emphasis is for Michael was, you know, these consciousness dimensions. He called it the consciousness dimension in text, was to allow us as like practitioners and individuals on the left, right, not to become ground down by the infighting and the drama online, and to realize these are kind of part of the conditions of being in a neoliberal digital marketplace, right? We're being incentivized to be oppositional with each other and hyper fragmented, to put forward a kind of a human-centric, empathy-centric practice to kind of combat against that sort of atomization, right? Because it's obviously, like, it's an enemy of everything we need to be working on and focusing on now, which is building solidarity, raising consciousness, reorganizing and reestablishing the labor movement. This requires a different kind of culture, and that requires a different sort of individual practice.
Yeah, for me, you know, you mentioned solidarity towards the end, and that's what I was thinking the whole time, because it came up on other panels as well. Like, it was so, especially the you know, Toure Reed and Adolf Reed one, that was great, but it was so, you know, just pivotal and crucial in what I call kind of Michael's intellectual synthesis and spiritual solidarity, right? And that those things can be married or enmeshed together because they're inseparable, really. So the holistic approach to geopolitics, to globalization, can't continue to be dominated by these kind of pseudo intellectual, boomer, integral, bourgeois, third way, right, type folk. And it can't continue to fragment the left, right? And you know, I think Michael was doing implicitly what I'm trying to also foster explicitly, which is consensus building, right? Consensus building among the left, of course, but also broader, you know, for a kind of public sociology, to develop a kind of coherent, consistent meta-narrative that will take us over the years, you know, to really galvanize political agency rather than have it continually captured, right? And we see so much of academic output, media output, captured by their own owners, right? It's just, it's a simplistic trope how kind of capital controls the discourse, but it's so true. And we need to break free of that. And so, you know, Michael was building relationships. He was also teaching his colleagues, like Anna Kasparian talks about often. She's so indebted to him for his guidance. And so, you know, the one of the manifold tragedies of this tragedy is that we only had one Michael Brooks when we need 10. We need hundreds and more, because it just seems like not only are we stagnant, but we're moving backwards continually, right? And so we want to get ahead of the discourse, ahead of the movements, and try to pull people forward and coalesce and build consensus, especially in a post-truth world and media environment, about what is true, what leftism in the broad transpartisan sense means, right? Because healthcare is a human right for everybody, and no other parts of the political spectrum are advocating for this. There's a lot of contrarianism and filibustering in the center of the political spectrum. And Michael was really trying to balance things out and get people's attention. And, you know, he was really just taking off this year, right? And what comes to mind is, you know, Lisha has mentioned that Michael had aspirations to be a host like Bill Maher, like functionally, not in terms of politics, but just to copy the kind of the function of it, and also to maybe become a senator one day. And I have no doubt that Michael would have achieved these things. His destiny was always beyond this little show carved out that was very personal to him. Like, I think his work always went beyond that, and that's what we're trying to carry forward and articulate. It's a constant practice of articulation to try to get through to each other.
So one thing I wanted to zero in on, which was one of the sort of syntheses that Michael left us, that I think was something, you know, not that he necessarily, he was always standing on the shoulders of everyone he brought together. But it's this concept of Cosmo-local. Jeremy, can you maybe kind of give us a sense of like where he was going with that? What does that mean to you? And you know, what were the ideas that he wanted us to hold kind of together, despite them being, you know, contradictory or kind of paradoxical in some ways?
Yeah. Cosmo-local. I know he was talking about how did he put it? Cosmo-local planetary meshworks. That was sort of his phrasing leading up to the publication of Against the Web. And I think, you know, in our conversations, the way he talked about Against the Web was that it was the beginning of a work, right? The beginning of really, it was that last chapter he felt he was, I think, most proud of in terms of like really beginning to articulate what that could mean. But in my understanding, Cosmo-local is this sense of, in our politics, in our activism, focusing on the hyperlocal in terms of particular down ballot races or labor organizing in a very concrete, tangible community, right? And using that as a lesson and relaying that back into an international context. And it's always this kind of oscillation, which is a very meta-modern theme, between the local and then the global, or the local and the planetary. And he calls it planetary meshworks because I think he didn't really want to articulate this in a sort of vision of a kind of totalizing singular theory of everything necessarily, or a vision that everybody had to kind of homogenously endorse, but nevertheless the possibility, and I think this is part of his aspirational vision for cosmopolitan socialism, that we can come together in a planetary context in a different way than, you know, modernity and globalization has united the world in a kind of hegemonic sense, right? In a sort of totalizing sense. There is another way to do globalization. And he really liked the word planetary. He drew that from, you know, one of his favorite thinkers, William Irwin Thompson, who's another kind of integral thinker and historian of consciousness who taught at MIT for a while, and kind of created something that I think, you know, Michael saw an element of in his own show, in the sense of Thompson created this Lindisfarne Association, which was a kind of a hub of intellectuals and artists and poets and economists in the 1970s, and biologists too. So just having these different thinkers and these different disciplines begin to explore what it would mean to come together as a species in the planetary context, and how this differentiated itself from just more colonization and more globalization and more industrialization. Is there another way, right? And that kind of, is there another way, is the sort of the context here for this cosmo-local approach, that I think was, again, very foundational for his thinking and aspiration towards becoming planetary.
Yeah, and I think it complements the material analysis of globalization and the necessary international solidarity and strategy that's going to be needed for the left to actually even operate, in nation states. Michael was fond of, pointing out that the end of the nation state is not near. These are the sort of polities that we're working with. Our local communities, our national politics, these things, they all matter still, and we need to find a way to both accomplish the social change in these societies that we live in as the left, but to realize that for macroeconomic reasons in a global market, especially countries outside of the US, it's very difficult for them to take steps by themselves without solidarity. It's very difficult for Greece to stand up to the EU when the Social Democratic parties in Germany are not supporting, the unions in Germany are not supporting them. And so I think to call it superstructure in a way, his analysis of consciousness, and where he was going with how we need to think about culture, how we need to think about, cultural appropriation and any number of things that he was kind of picking at the conventional wisdom of. I think it was something that he was unique in that way. He just was. He had a unique insight into how these things would tie together. And I think the consciousness dimension with the material, the grounding in the Marx, that was I think what he brought to Integral, what he brought to the consciousness, what he brought to the this online kind of intellectual milieu, was he brought the historicization, he brought the material analysis. And by tying those things together, he I think really was figuring out something new, something synthetic. Speaking of the intellectual side, what do you think the role of kind of conversations like this, highfalutin intellectual, philosophical debates, what is the role of this type of thinking and work and study and discussion on the left, consciousness related or integral related or metamodern or otherwise? What is the role of that, and how does it help us in the struggle, or not?
Well, maybe I'll try. I mean, from my position, because I've tried to intervene on how these metamodern discourses are co-discovered and deployed, I think the role is to build consensus and to weed out the pathologies and the anomalies, so you develop a common purpose and a kind of the opposite of groupthink, but consensus, so that we're on the same page and we're not losing time and wasting time in redundant theory. So again, coming back to Michael's synthesis, like he was, in a positive sense, like cherry picking the best of the best and saying this is how it all ties together, and there's a number of ways to do that. And the more we do that and the more they overlap, the more robust and resilient that intellectual consensus becomes, right? And so for all the materialist analysis, which I'm totally on board with, you also need a ideological and ideational analysis to continually deconstruct and reconstruct the discourse, how we talk to each other. And maybe quickly, I'll tie back to the IDW, because they became popular for performing a kind of civility and rational discourse. But from a leftist perspective, it fell short. Right. And so what I think we are trying to do in this conversation and beyond is demonstrate that we can do better. We can do much, much better. And if we're to sit down across from people like Dave Rubin or Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, we can win. We can change minds. We can change their minds potentially. We can certainly sway their audience's minds. And so I think that's what we're trying to foster in this little microcosm. And that's what we want to happen in the macrocosm too.
But I think just to push back a little, I mean, I think the theory of change about changing minds, I think, is a debatable one. I think it's when it comes to the way institutions change, the way political economy actually changes. I think the act of changing minds broadly, at least in the way that we conceive of it now, in a kind of broadcast sense of on the population level, maybe on the individual level in an organizing space, changing minds is the way that things move on a micro stage. But I guess what other than changing minds and winning the battle of ideas is there a role for the intellectual, the philosophical, the self-inquiry? What is that space?
I'll quickly just both and that and yes and that, because I think you're correct, and we can move forward through a dialectic on those points. So I just wanted to add that, like, I could steel man you and keep running with it, but Jeremy, if you have a follow up, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think sort of the premise of the first question here about, where does highfalutin discussions like this one fit in, Michael's vision for rebuilding the left and growing the left and actually, obtaining some kind of Machiavellian power, right, in terms of in the real world. Part of this, I think, is really kind of being flexible. There is a kind of fluidity, not only of thinking that Michael was really articulating in his last stream, but also kind of the ability to go into macro highfalutin intellectual discussion and then immediately move back into local on the ground politics, organizing, etc. Right? So being able to do that flip, maybe like Gramsci's organic intellectual is a good sort of clarifying image here of like being involved and capable of shifting back and forth between the intellectual and the organizational, right? So how do we strengthen the power of institutions? That requires an intellectual analysis, but then it also requires getting involved in particular, labor organizing or consciousness raising activity that's on the ground. But having that flexibility, I think, is really important. And my second short answer that I've been thinking about a lot is like, okay, what's the role of this online though, right? As like media pundits, and we're not just talking about ideas here, right? I think a media pundit and having some kind of public intellectual presence is also kind of working with the media landscape, being an architect of a media ecology. And I think there's a big responsibility in that. So if these other folks in the IDW are going out there and creating platforms and holding a discourse and capturing individuals and building these communities, the left needs to see a role and a responsibility in doing the same kind of thing. And I think this also speaks to where Michael continue to emphasize, like, okay, what is the IDW doing that is so attractive, right? Let's really listen to that and empathize with that so we can articulate a healthier expression of that, right? So to answer your question, why talk about highfalutin ideas, is to give this bigger picture. Yeah, high-level ideas, is to give this bigger picture. It's meaningful to have a bigger picture and a bigger vision. It's aspirational, it's motivational, it's healthy for building the left to have a kind of positive and constructive vision of where we want to go. Michael again called it exit strategy, but also he said, the left needs to become regenerative in that sense of, yeah, here's a positive expression of a different kind of future. I mean, this sort of goes into Mark Fisher's work as well, right? In terms of, can we articulate features beyond capitalist realism? The left's responsibility, I think, is to engage in highfalutin, high-level ideas and talk about those possibilities and be flexible enough to kind of get back into the grit and understand this is an organizational and an institutional process.
One of those big ideas, I think, that Michael brings in the integral frame that I think is another both and when it comes to, I think, democratizing the workplace, being the grounding, the labor movement, worker self-directed enterprises, as Professor Wolf says, but also this idea of the commons or peer-to-peer. Can you guys maybe talk through kind of where Michael was looking at folks like Michel Bauwens and the peer-to-peer movement, and not strictly kind of traditionally socialistic models for certain parts of the economy or human life, but ones which could still be part of an integral post-capitalism?
Yeah, I'll just mention quickly and then pass it to Brent that I think with common studies and peer-to-peer, Michael's very interested in the context of this being an exit strategy. So like in the tech world, how is peer-to-peer, right? Peer-to-peer networks, alternative currencies, et cetera. He was very skeptical of about, the whatever was in vogue at the time in terms of like Bitcoin or whatever kind of digital currency. But the principle of peer-to-peer networks, worker cooperatives, these kind of, democratizing the workplace, these offer both theoretical and practical answers to, well, what do we do? Like, what comes next? How can we organize? Where can we put our energy into in terms of decentering these structures of power in a way that actually gives us power, right? Gives the people power. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there in that context. But the common studies I would recommend as a kind of a terminology for understanding shared space, right? Understanding the kind of process in which capitalism has atomized individuals and how we might be able to reclaim the commons going forward in some kind of new and innovative way through digital work, through Richard Wolff's work in terms of worker cooperatives and really kind of pushing for that, et cetera. So.
Yeah, I'll just add that, the commons type of discourse and decentralization, it's a kind of depoliticized approach to socialism, right? And to kind of a systems solidarity. And so Michel Bauwens and others, and there's a little bit of a libertarian thread coming through there, but I think Michael's interest was to make it inclusive to the left, right? And make it proud to be leftist, so it can be enacted, because again, a lot of these narratives get captured by center and right-wing ideologies that are fundamentally dead ends. So it's part of, and I think with the Bernie Sanders movement, this was a kind of shortcoming, perhaps not an outright failure, but definitely a shortcoming. I wished so much that since 2016, Bernie Sanders would have embraced that language too, and accommodated more of the, not techno-optimists, but like systems change literate type thinkers, right? And so that's where someone like Bauwens comes in, and Bauwens considers himself part of the integral left, which is why Michael was pointing to the three of us together. But there's still so much to work out. I talked with Michel about this, culture war wise. He was actually aligned with Michael, but also would kind of cite the occasional right winger to defend an anti-woke position, right? And so it's very important that we move the needle to, towards what people like Michael and Touré Reed are saying, so we kind of just are on top of that social current that is pushing back against wokeism, but doesn't actually know how to end racism, systemic racism. So again, this is a public discourse issue, and it ties back to the media, how irresponsible the media ecology is, how captured it is by capitalism, and why the media, above all other sectors, needs mediation, needs conflict resolution, needs kind of ideological consultation and critique. So again, I think that's what Michael is trying to pioneer, is trying to kind of a very, very convergent leftist discourse and movement that had some long-term thinking and integrated these systems change type ideas and what I call paradigm shift. Right? It's a kind of loaded term, but I think it's very appropriate to bring it into the conversation in a responsible way, because it really speaks to a change in all sectors and all levels and sort of classes and locales at once, and in an overlapping way temporally. Like, these things happen over decades. There's not a single singularity, but many singularities. And so if we are to, solve the major systemic threats that we face, like climate change, which is a very impersonal systemic threat that even the Pentagon recognizes, we need a leftist politics to come into the center frame, like Lula, and actually change things and demonstrate the efficacy of these policies in a way that they can't be reversed, and that people like Lula can't be imprisoned.
Yeah, and I think the commons and experimenting with other models to help us figure out, like, how would a post-capitalist society need to function? What would we need to incubate now to start to get ourselves ready from a resilience standpoint, from a local. I know he was also interested in permaculture, regenerative agriculture, all these different ways that we need to kind of attack the common problems and threats that we're facing. He was looking for, a way to bring those things together and figure out what works. And I think that was one of the things that from a commons perspective, or from a decentralization perspective, or from some of these, things from the open source software movement and ideas that have gone off the rails in the past. They can go in a really bad direction. But it doesn't mean that everything that they bring to the table isn't potentially, some of it could be useful. And I think the last thing I wanted to touch on is, from an individual perspective, if you look at, Wilber's quadrants that Michael liked to talk about a lot, where is the space for the left to kind of get, I don't want to say into the self-help business, because I think, I mean, it's not that you need to match, what a Jordan Peterson are doing one for one, but what does the left, what does an integral left, an integral and cosmopolitan left have to say about self-help, about the self, about human distinction, about, doing the work? Not typically something that we talk about on the left, if only because it's the neoliberal, individualization we need to counteract by talking about systems, talking about, political economy. But that doesn't mean there isn't an individual dimension. So where can we find some light to be shed on that?
Yeah. I'll just mention briefly, I think some of Mark Fisher's work is relevant here in the context of situating individual mental health with, again, the context of capitalist realism and socioeconomic issues, particularly his recent posthumous publication through Repeater Books called Post-Capitalist Desire. There's a lot of commentary on really kind of relating and kind of in a sort of martial arts sense, really kind of taking this emphasis on individualism and individual health and well-being, and really contextualizing that in a more socio and material context, and going like, okay, your well-being is in the context of, the unhealth or the ailments of this particular society, let's say capitalist realism, social alienation, etc. So I think really kind of using that in a different way. Like, I really think that, a lot of the self-help work, and Michael was, he did meditation, right? He had a spiritual practice. He was familiar with that world, and he had a different container for it. So I think it's really about how do we contextualize these practices and sort of strip them of that make mindfulness ideology, right? And contextualize them in a more social and, again, grounded material ideology in terms of understanding what these processes are doing to us, and not attributing, let's say, like your own mental, again, the Jordan Peterson approach versus, the James Hillman approach. So I'll leave it here at the moment, but I think it's all about the appropriate container for those kinds of practices and fields.
Yeah, it's a tough question. You're asking good pointed questions, Ben, but it gives us an opportunity to come back to the idea of contradictions and synthesizing, because it's tempting to try to give just a systems level answer to everything, because it is such a overarching determinant, and a lot of problems are over determined, right? And climate change is going to continue to be one of those Archimedean points of either global destruction, barbarism, or socialism, eco-socialism, and a solution to the problem. And so with regards to self-help, like ironically, over a decade ago, it was new atheists like Michael Shermer who pointed out that the self-help movement, they referred to it as sham self-help and actualization movement, that a lot of these new age threads and trends were, in fact, they undercut the individual and they made them addicted to self-help. And so I say all that to preface, though, that any kind of response to these things, we have to continually articulate a balanced perspective that addresses the individual unique situation and personality and socioeconomic circumstances, and also the system level thinking, and like oscillate, as Jeremy said, between them, because that's what we have to provide as a synthetic answer, rather than just the kind of systems level counterpoint to the IDW. But it's clear to us and others at the outset that the IDW had a reductionist hyper focus on individualism, a kind of methodological individualism, which in fact has been pretty much debunked in contemporary social science literature. So again, for me, it comes back to, can we build consensus around a lot of these high-level discourses? So what I call implicit metamodernism is all the literature over the last 20 years that points to some sort of paradigm shift or systems change or zeitgeist or awakening that actually overlaps and dovetails rather than contradicts each other, because these scholars and activists are trying to work out the contradictions, right? And that goes back to Marx's project. But I've argued for a long time, and it's hard to do this, that we need to go way beyond Marx and Marxism, right? And I think Michael, even in the afterlife, for lack of a better word, can continue that conversation with us. He can continue to lead that conversation, even just through his little book Against the Web. So we just need to keep unpacking the in-between space and the both and, so that we can have real coherence in our political approach and real global solidarity. And I'll throw out one more word that I think is so relevant to metamodernism and Michael's project, and that's alter globalization, right? And that's another high-level word that since the 90s has been used to describe these sort of WTO protests, the Occupy movement, and these trends. And I know I'm rambling, but just to bring it back to media, like the media has willfully, consciously dropped the ball on the public's, as the fourth estate, the public role it has to educate people and to provide a platform for discourse and debate to work out these issues. So alter globalization is the extant, existing, counter-hegemonic, post-capitalist movement that we need and that we have, and it just needs to be tied together further and to win politically.
Cool. Where can people find more of your work, guys? Jeremy?
Sure. So actually, I kind of wanted to use this moment to talk about a potential collaboration that we were just talking with Lisha about. So it's very fresh and there's no formal announcements yet, but I've got a podcast in an online community called Mutations. We have a Discord. I have been hosting a channel on that Discord platform for the integral left, is what we're calling it. It's really kind of just a studying platform for integral theory, leftist discourse, touching on this kind of consciousness studies related material, while also, again, like in the vision that Michael articulated, looking at a material analysis, grounding ourselves in leftist discourse and theory, etc. So there's that, and that's sort of my platform. You can tune into Mutations as a podcast as well. And Michael actually was on that. So I've recently re-uploaded that episode. I think it's episode 5 or 6. It should be available. You don't have to scroll down too far in the archive to find it. And that was recorded, I think, back in 2017. So definitely listen to that after this conversation if you're interested. And one of the things Lisha and I were talking about is hosting some kind of book club in an ongoing way through TMBS, through the Patreon channel. So if you're interested in that, I think we're going to be hosting the first book club, really kind of going through a lot of Michael's literature, his recommended reading, with integral theory in mind. So I would love to, as a sort of back-to-back, look at Against the Web with a Theory of Everything. So bringing Ken Wilber and Michael together, commenting on his recordings, talking about how Marxism and integral theory come together. So we'll be doing that, and I think we'll be reading many other books. So definitely tune in on TMBS on the Patreon, and then also feel free to tune in with me on Mutations.
You can find me on Twitter at Tato_tweets. And also I have a Medium blog linked from there. And also my website is abs-tract.org, and it's easy to get a hold of me through there too. And so I welcome collaboration, because leftists can't do this alone. And there's way too many left behind, people imprisoned and people disappeared. And so we need a really cosmopolitan solidarity. and I'll endorse what Jeremy's doing, and I'll be collaborating with him. He's a great host and facilitator, and we need more of those spaces. And so I would say we're behind schedule, but this is also just the beginning of a new thread.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, guys. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. I think this is something that Michael would have really liked people to follow up on, to engage with the ideas with, even if some of them don't necessarily resonate, or you get, the messenger of those ideas, their other ideas may sort of poison the well. And I think, it's fair for people to have that reaction, particularly for some of the people we're talking about. But I think it is an area where he was trying to bring together new things, break new ground. And I think we all can learn a lot from trying to take on not just these ideas, but also the way of thinking, the integral way of thinking that he left us with, and try to use that, hone it ourselves. So thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.